thank you for continuing to give us your full attention as we move into our third panel. And for the purpose of introducing it, I'm going to introduce to you Gabriel Zylstra of Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Hello, everyone. I'm Gabriel Zylstra. I'm a member of the Coolidge Foundation's Debate Honor Society, the 1890 Society, and I'm a student at Hillsdale College. The title of this next session, Session 3, is The Great Society, Business and Government as Providers, 1960 to 1980. Our moderator is Mr. Kent Lastman. Mr. Lastman has served as the president and CEO of the Competitive Enterprise Institute since 2016. Mr. Lastman's experience includes testifying before Congress as well as state legislatures, participating in regulatory proceedings and reform efforts, and earlier in his career, Mr. Lastman was the founding director of the Institute for Regulatory Law and Economics. He serves on the board of directors at the Center for the International Private Economics. Please welcome Kent Lastman and our board of panelists.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. It is quite intimidating to be seated with the people to my immediate left. Each of them has full lives that are documented in your programs, and I will give just the briefest of introductions before we start, because I want to save as much time as we can for interaction with you. We've had a theme today. We heard it clearly just a moment ago from Mr. Ham. We heard it this morning talking about the Wright brothers. And I want to invite you to listen to our presentations in the next panel with the word of exploration at the forefront of your mind. Private enterprise, business leaders, innovators, the entrepreneurs who create where there was nothing. These are people who are going out into the empty space. They're going out into the place where there are no paths. And when they do so with a point of service. They are there to create something for each of us and to make the world better. And that certainly calls to mind the way Mr. Coolidge thought about entrepreneurs. We heard last night from Amity Schlaze when she said, referencing Coolidge, the man who builds a factory builds a temple, and the man who works there worships there. And to each is due not scorn and blame, but reverence and praise. And so it's with reverence and praise that we bring you this panel. And I am here to simply give you the context for a couple decades of American life so that we can dive deeper on the people who deserve that praise, and we're doing the exploration. In the post-war era, there was a tremendous boom in American life. After rapid military developments in the 1950s, we had entered the space age. It was not only a technical achievement, but it was part of the American imagination. Economic growth in the 1960s was quite high. It averaged around 4 to 5%. 4 to 5%, all while a period of falling unemployment. By the late 1960s and through the 1970s, inflation had taken hold and eventually began to climb to record heights, distorting not only savings but investment. This period gave us 4 recessions, culminating with what was called the double dip recession in 1980 and then again in 81 and 82. Meanwhile, college enrollments were growing, largely on the backs of enrollment in state institutions. We saw from 45% up to 55% of college-age adults going on for further education and training. However, mobility was falling. For decades, approximately 20% of the American population would choose to move more than 100 miles from where they were born. It was in this era that it began a decline from 20% down to 17%, and today it hovers around 10 to 11%. So America mid-century was increasingly confident. There was growth and mobility. We had rapid innovation fueled by education. But there were also pressures in American life. There were new social norms, and those social norms were matched by a new idea, or more accurately, an old idea about the role of government. It was President Johnson who expertly shepherded civil rights legislation and also new government programs for just about everything. His Great Society was premised on public sector provision. And in 1964's speech at the University of Michigan, he called for changes to the city, the countryside, and the classroom. Just about everything. America spent billions of dollars on ill-fated programs. And yet our cities were in turmoil. Baltimore, Detroit, Los Angeles, riots in each. About a mile and a half from where we sit today, Washington, D.C. burned. In one 2-week period, on either side of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., Washington, D.C. reported 1,100 fires, mostly through arson. 13 people were killed. 7,000 people were arrested in a 4-day span. We face powerful forces driving dramatic changes. And meanwhile, there was a quiet revolution underway because Americans were building, and they were innovating, and they were deregulating. And that is the topic of our conversation today. First, we'll hear from Hank Meyer. He's the chairman of Meyer Industries. He has written both for general audiences and scholarly. He'll be followed by Chris DeMuth, who has served at the highest level of the federal government, as well as in leading think tanks such as the American Enterprise Institute, the Hudson Institute, and the Heritage Foundation. After Chris, I will turn to Diana at the end of the table here. Diana Furchtgott-Roth, like Chris, has served in multiple administrations at the highest levels of policymaking. She will speak to us about the role of prices and the interaction with government policy. And our wrap-up, our cleanup hitter, will be Jim Lucier, who brings 3 decades of analysis of what happens in Washington and how it affects the private sector. I'm very much looking forward to this exploration and invite you to help me welcome Hank Meyer.
Well, thank you, Kent, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is a humbling privilege to be with this group today and to talk about something not to do with production and manufacturing, but how in the 1960s, Americans saw the rise of a new form of commerce, mass retailing. That is the selling of a wide variety of stuff to a wide variety of people. And that might trace its roots back to the markets and bazaars of the Middle Ages, or maybe to the first great Paris department store, which was brought to life in a novel by Emile Zola in 1882. I only mention that because my grandfather, Hendrik Meyer, who was a Dutch factory kid with a 6th grade education, read that book in Dutch long before he ever became a shopkeeper, long before he even emigrated to the United States in 1907. But the seeds of its modern incarnation were actually planted in the Coolidge era with the spread of self-service grocery stores, and then with the Great Depression putting ever more pressure on household incomes and the populist threat of regulating chain stores failing to curtail their growth, companies such as A&P, Kroger, Safeway, name some of you may have run across, marched across the American landscape, making the general store or the corner grocery with its clerk behind the counter entering your order on a ledger book account nearly obsolete. With their growth came an expansion of the concept of a grocery store, from a few shelves of canned goods to ever larger stores, incorporating fresh produce. Of course, fewer Americans were living on farms or growing their own, as well as a butcher's counter and baked goods. And self-service became known as cash and carry when the chain stores lowered prices by doing away with credit accounts and home delivery. A small grocer like my barber grandfather, who opened a store the size of basically of the room where we picked up our lunch and get our refreshments in 1934, and he did that because he owned a vacant storefront next door to his barber shop, and he'd taken a loan out from the local bank to outfit that store, and then couldn't find anybody to rent it, and so had to. The bank wouldn't foreclose in 1934 because they didn't want more worthless real estate on their books, and so he had to figure out a way to pay and generate revenue, and so we got $328 worth of groceries on credit. Soon he had a choice to make, though. Copy the chain stores on price and variety, or be another of those corner groceries who went out of business. He chose to compete. He expanded the store, and one store led to another and another. And with the growing prosperity after World War II, change only accelerated. And Kent touched on some of that. Those big grocery stores now called themselves supermarkets. They were becoming showcases of innovation. It's where shoppers first encountered not only shopping carts, but automatic doors and moving conveyor belts at the checkout and a dizzying array of frozen foods and seemingly endless varieties of foods of all sorts. And after the war, far more households owned at least one car. You were no longer dependent on that neighborhood grocery store if you could find a better bargain within convenient driving distance. The growth of suburbs only added momentum to that trend. And many more households not only had refrigerators, which continued to grow in holding power, but freezers too. And you could drive to the store of your choice and stock up on milk, pasteurized milk now, or ice cream, or meat, or TV dinners. But that gleaming world of self-service in the supermarket had yet to touch other channels of commerce. Downtown department stores were updated bazaars, but little changed from the late 19th century in that Zola novel, and still priced out of reach of many Americans, even as the middle class was growing. And elsewhere, the alternative was still the small shopkeeper, often good at service to be sure, but higher priced, or the Sears or JCPenney catalog. And there were legal constraints as well. Many states had what were called fair trade laws, allowing manufacturers to set a price below which retailers could not sell their brand or their products. The manufacturer's suggested retail price, which you still see mentioned sometimes, was often mandated by law. Supermarkets might have experimented with what is called general merchandise, that's non-food items, but the major grocery chains were mostly unionized and organized around supply chains that were a lot less complicated than what general merchandise, from apparel to toys to tools, required. The only parallel to supermarkets may have been the five and dime stores, such as S.S. Kresge or Ben Franklin, predecessors in their way of today's dollar stores that we see everywhere. So the next chapter in American retailing was left to entrepreneurs. The great old textile factories of New England, heavily unionized, were shutting down as the industry moved to the Carolinas in search of cheaper labor. In the cavernous real estate they left behind, a new phenomenon began to emerge, buying closeouts or overrun deals, and in some cases challenging those fair trade laws while working with hungry manufacturers. Merchants, entrepreneurs were offering general merchandise in increasing variety at discount prices. And the key word here is discount. Discounts off the prevailing higher prices that had secured many department and specialty stores healthy profit margins while putting a ceiling on the spending power of the American shopper. These were the discount houses of the 1950s, emulating the self-service strategies of the supermarket, piling goods into great displays and expecting customers to make their own selections and wait on themselves. The first of these were one-offs, but some began to sprout into chains, the names of which are largely forgotten and unknown probably to anyone in this room under 50, Miracle Mart, Arlen's, E.J. Corvette, Caldor, Zare. But they caught the attention of a couple of supermarket operators in western Michigan. My father and grandfather had by 1960 built a chain of a dozen supermarkets. Their newest store was on a busy suburban corner in Grand Rapids. They had vacant land next door. Wouldn't it be a great attraction if they could combine the appeal of a modern supermarket and a low-price discount store on the same site? Wouldn't that make their supermarket more successful? Well, they certainly thought so. They hired a real estate broker who pitched the idea to some of those chains, but no one bit. They were also working with a consultant who offered a seductive pitch when none of the discounters showed an interest. Why not open your own discount store? Because actually, you really didn't need to know anything about selling fashions or shoes or toys. Why, you just leased the space to individual merchants who knew their business. You were just a glorified landlord. Could that be so hard? So in 1961, they broke ground on a 100,000 square foot addition to their supermarket building. They were well along with construction when it occurred to them that if they were actually running the whole enterprise, they didn't need to divide the building in two. It may speak to the riskiness of the venture that they poured an extra thick concrete floor with the thought that if the store didn't work, it might be suitable for a car dealership. But with the decision to combine what would otherwise be two separate stores under one roof behind a single array of checkouts, you might say that the idea of one-stop shopping was born. They called it Thrifty Acres, catching the spirit of big and cheap. I remember my 7th grade math teacher mocking the notion that anyone would buy a bra and a head of lettuce on the same shopping trip. And I just wanted to crawl under my desk. But it was an enormous gamble for a little company. But it was local news, and we passed around, some of you may have seen it, the NBC TV affiliate in Grand Rapids in 1963 now ran a promotional ad for the breadth of its news coverage, juxtaposing Mao Zedong, the ruler of communist China, with my dad and grandfather standing in the aisle of their new store. The caption began, "From one side of the world, we tell of despotism and an experiment in human misery. From the other, on Grand Rapids' busy 28th Street, we report the benefits of superstore merchandising." For our family, it was only a beginning. It was a fraught beginning because Hendrik and Fred had already committed to 2 more big stores and were deeply in debt. The consultant's pitch, how they could just be glorified landlords, was not working. Each of their tenants for the different departments had their own ideas on everything from pricing to quality to return policies. It was a Tower of Babel. Fred and Hendrik scrambled to buy out their lessees, sent one of their colleagues to the garment district in New York to learn about fashions, working with importers for the first time. It was a steep learning curve, but they made it work. The year 1962, when we opened the first Thrifty Acres, now we just call it a Meyer store, will go down as a watershed year in American retail history. It was the same year that the dime store chain SS Kresge opened the first Kmart. The Dayton department stores in Minneapolis opened the first Target. And then a Ben Franklin franchisee, Sam Walton, opened the first Walmart in Arkansas. And to come full circle to Paris, the French retailer Carrefour opened its first big store called a hypermarket, a name we adopted for a few years in the 1970s and 1980s until Walmart decided to copy us and call their version of our stores supercenters. What began as a risky experiment in Grand Rapids has become, particularly through Walmart's national reach, the most frequent, and I like to say in our own case, the preferred way to shop for a majority of Americans. And finally, I would be remiss not to circle back not only to France, but to China. A friend of mine, a professor at Western Michigan University, also taught for some years at the prestigious Nankai University in Tianjin in northern China. Before a spring semester there in 1989, he had put together a slideshow to illustrate for his Chinese students what daily life was like for typical Americans. He included photos from our store in Kalamazoo. That spring saw the dramatic uprising in Tiananmen Square in Beijing when young Chinese protesters challenged their rulers and stood down the tanks of the People's Liberation Army. That summer, when my friend came back from China, we met for lunch. We were talking about his experience when he said in a very matter-of-fact way, "You know, you're responsible for what happened in Tiananmen Square." Now, I was taken aback. This is obviously a bit of gross hyperbole, but he went on to explain, "It was students from Tianjin who helped organize the protests, and nothing I taught in my class made a bigger impression than the abundance and freedom of choice for everyday Americans that your store represented." What we do today is no longer revolutionary. It's part of the fabric of American life. Fair trade laws have largely disappeared. Price controls have come and gone. We're not losing sleep over the prospect of government-run grocery stores. We do lose sleep over the ubiquity of Amazon trucks clogging our streets when their retailing revenue is little more than a rounding error in the cloud-driven profit stream, or Walmart's unrivaled scale securing deals from vendors that makes the rest of us smaller competitors apprehensive. But it seems to me that the innovation is no longer a generational event as history might have had it before. It's an everyday opportunity, and for the sake of American prosperity, it needs to stay that way. Thank you.
Thank you, Hank Meyer. It's a great story about inventing a new way to sell to American markets. I'm going to next invite Chris DeMuth to tell us about inventing new American markets.
The 1960s and 1970s that we're concerned with were decades of busy, assertive, top-down government. LBJ's Great Society, Richard Nixon's wage and price controls, Jimmy Carter's Departments of Education and Energy, powerful new regulatory agencies concerned with health, safety, environmental quality, and much else. Most of those initiatives fell radically short of their promises, and many of them made matters worse. Keith Lassman has given us some of the lowlights, and those programs were expensive. Federal spending grew from 19% of the economy in 1960 to 22.5% in 1980, and if we measured in the costs of all of the regulatory programs, it would have been well more than 25% of the national economy. The spending was financed by regular deficits for the first time in American history. Annual inflation averaged more than 5%, so that by 1980, the value of a dollar had fallen to a crummy 1/3 of what it had been in 1960. The 1970s brought stagflation, growing employment as well as inflation. By 1980, the misery index was nearly 20%, 13.5% inflation, plus 7.2% unemployment. And yet, the private economy chugged along respectably in the face of these impositions. GDP grew at an annual rate of 3.6% on average, so that in 1980 it had doubled from where it was in 1960. A critical driver was new and improved technology. The price of a 5-minute coast-to-coast telephone call, measured in today's dollars, fell from $40 in 1960 to $2 in 1980. But technology, to achieve its promise in full, required skilled technologists with a spirit of enterprise and a taste for adventure. That spirit found its home in California's Santa Clara County, which would soon become known as Silicon Valley. In the 1950s, it was a valley of fruit trees, producing most of America's apricots and 1/3 of the world's prunes. By 2000, it would be the most dynamic center of business innovation in human history, and just getting started. Today, it is home to 5 of the 10 largest companies in the world: NVIDIA, Apple, Alphabet, Google, Meta, Facebook, and Broadcom, whose combined market capitalization is more than $16 trillion. Plus, the centabillion runners-up: Oracle, Netflix, Cisco, Intel, and Adobe. Plus, innumerable smaller outfits plotting to join and maybe overtake the big boys. Silicon Valley regularly absorbs more research investment and generates more patents than anywhere else. Its products, smartphones and laptops, search engines, social media, cloud computing, AI, are part of the daily lives of billions of people. If the region were a nation, its economy would rank with Switzerland. It would be Israel and Norway combined. The founding fathers of this transformation were David Packard and William Hewlett, who named their partnership Hewlett-Packard based on a coin toss. They were classmates at Stanford in the 1930s with a shared interest in electronics and mathematics. The big electronics firms such as General Electric were on the East Coast, and Packard went east to work at GE for a time. But those firms were devoted to sustaining established markets in such things as power generation and radio, and the two Californians wanted to try new things. Their favorite Stanford professor was keen on commercializing academic ideas and developing the local economy. With his encouragement, they set up shop in the garage behind Packard's home in Palo Alto. Hewlett lived in an adjacent one-room shack with a dirt floor. Mrs. Packard kept the books at the kitchen table. Their first product was a superior audio oscillator that Hewlett had perfected in a Stanford lab. They sold 8 of them to Walt Disney Studios, where they contributed to the sonic innovations in Disney's path-breaking 1940 movie, Fantasia. That garage is now a National Historic Site, designated the birthplace of Silicon Valley. But they soon outgrew it. During World War II, Bill Hewlett was drafted while Dave Packard stayed behind to supervise production of sophisticated battlefield equipment, aviation instruments, counter-radar devices, proximity fuses. When Bill got back from the war, he discovered that Dave had been holding all HP salaries, including his own, to no more than Bill's Army pay. That, like the Toyn cost to decide the firm's name order, epitomized the duo's principled devotion to their enterprise, which they proceeded to impart to growing ranks of employees. They called their business philosophy the HP way, and it boiled down to one word: contribution. The company's purpose was to produce high-quality products with advanced technology that solved customers' problems and improved their work. Profits were not a purpose, but rather a feedback loop, the measure of the company's contributions and the source of its investments in further contributions. In the 1950s and 1960s, Hewlett-Packard specialized in measurement and testing instruments for business, medicine, and the military. Its product line grew to the hundreds, employment to the thousands, and revenues to the hundreds of millions. It deepened its alliance with Stanford, establishing research labs on university property and financing graduate studies for its employees, which attracted top young engineers from across the country. In 1964, it produced the world's first solid-state cesium beam atomic clock. HP flew the device around the planet as it went, synchronizing all the world's atomic clocks to within 1/1,000,000th of a second. That paved the way for the synchronous global and space communications we all now take for granted. And then, by accident, Hewlett-Packard invented the desktop computer. HP had designed electronic controllers for its measurement devices, but its engineers thought they might be repurposed for general use to replace the noisy, cumbersome mechanical calculators then in every business office. Introduced in 1968, the HP Model 9100 desktop was called a calculator rather than a computer, so as to sound familiar and to avoid attracting the attentions of IBM. But it was a true computer with instant calculation of trigonometric, logarithmic, and hyperbolic functions, and capable of being programmed for extended procedures. The 9100 was a technology landmark and immense commercial success, but an even bigger one soon followed. HP's Silicon Valley neighbors, booming, were now producing ever smaller and faster microprocessors. HP adapted them to create the first handheld computer, released in 1972. The slide rule, anybody remember that? Venerable and ubiquitous, log trig, recently in service on the moon with Apollo 11, disappeared overnight. The The succession of HP handhelds throughout the 1970s featured sophisticated financial, scientific, and math functions, and you could write your own programs and store them on a little magnetic strip. The devices introduced reverse Polish notation to the masses. Anyone heard of that? It is more efficient than algebraic notation for calculations of any complexity. Many people my age remember that the appearance of these devices in the 1970s was as miraculous as the iPhone in 2007. Millions upon millions were sold. The brilliant and powerful HP-12C was introduced in 1981 and has been in continuous production ever since. $37 at Amazon. Here's mine. HP has had its ups and downs in those subsequent 45 years, but is today the leading producer of personal computers and office printers. And of course, many of its neighborhood firms have come to either greater prominence. Silicon Valley was boosted by military investments, but was not the result of deliberate government policy. Indeed, California was a relatively high-tax, actively regulated state, even in the 1960s and 1970s. But one of its laws, going back to the California Gold Rush, banned non-compete clauses in employment contracts. Elsewhere, non-compete contracts were used to prevent restless employees from leaving for other firms or to start up their own. In Silicon Valley, employees had greater agency. In the early 1970s, 2 HP employees, engineering genius Steve Wozniak and a summer intern, teenager Steve Jobs, conceived a new kind of personal computer aimed at hobbyists and household use. HP officialdom, intently focused on professional and academic markets, rejected the idea 5 times. So Wozniak and Jobs became the latter-day Hewlett and Packard. They formed their own startup in 1976 and called it Apple Computer Company. Their first headquarters, naturally, was a garage. The deep explanation of Silicon Valley is a highly entrepreneurial culture personified by Dave Packard and Bill Hewlett. It was fostered by development-minded Stanford of yore, where the term engineering scholar was used without irony. It was a culture of invention, risk-taking, intellectual networking, competitive mobility, decentralized management, hospitality to immigrants from across the Pacific, and continuous translation of bull session brainstorms into valuable products. Pioneered by HP, that culture took hold through a process of intense local mimesis that no other locality could match. Dave Packard once directed an HP engineer to discontinue work on a speculative, idiosyncratic research project. But this time, the work continued in secret, resulting in a highly successful new display monitor. Dave's response was to present the rebel with an award at a company retreat. It read, "For extraordinary contempt and defiance beyond the normal call of engineering duty." America's economic dynamism, which has propelled the nation through innumerable eras of policy and politics, is the upshot of a million such acts of Damn the Torpedoes initiative. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Perhaps the only thing that can dwarf a place where centimillionaires or centibillionaires are the second tier is the federal government. And we're going to ask Diana Furchtgott-Roth for remarks on public policy as it relates to this era of American life.
Sure. So the topic of our panel is the successes of government and private business. And what I'm going to talk about is how the federal government tried to reduce prices, tried to keep inflation in check in the 60s and 70s, but did not succeed. And I have a graph over here, the CPI, consumer price inflation rate, the percent change. You could see it at the very beginning in 1960. You could see it at the end, which is 1980. And you can see that despite wage and price controls, inflation still rose. Well, how many of you think that the government can lower prices? One over there. One person over there thinks the government can lower prices. Anybody else? How many of you think that printing money raises prices? All of you. Well, it shows that you all are a lot smarter than Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, and Carter. Over the period 1960 to 1980, presidents tried to lower prices, but they made things work. In fact, one of the times I was at the White House as Chief of Staff of the Council of Economic Advisors, President George W. Bush really wanted to lower gasoline prices. You know, gasoline prices are the price that people can see every day as they drive down the street. It's the most visible price there is. And presidents really do not like the price of gasoline going up. Why? Because all of you, when you drive, you don't like the price of gasoline going up. So it makes that president less popular. And the Council of Economic Advisors tried to think of a lot of ways, or what we were really doing was shooting down the other suggestions in the White House as to why it is not possible to keep these gasoline prices down. There was only one way to lower gasoline prices. Do any of you know what it is? If you're a president, how would you lower gasoline prices? Well, that's one of them. One of them is drill, drill, drill. Yes, exactly. Any other ideas? That's another great idea. That's another great idea. Well, getting the stockpile, that is also a great idea. But perhaps some of you don't know that each state or groups of states have recipes for the kind of gasoline they can sell in their state. So California's recipe for gasoline is different from Nevada's recipe for gasoline. So it means that if prices go up in one state, you cannot move gasoline from the next door state over to the higher price state, which would lower these prices. So our idea at the Council of Economic Advisors was to get rid of what was called these boutique fuel standards. These boutique fuel standards to allow gasoline to flow from states that had a lot of it to states that had less gasoline. Well, the powers that be actually did not like that idea because waiving or suspending these boutique fuel requirements was what was called anti-environmental, because they were put in place so that there would be fewer emissions. And the administration didn't like higher gasoline prices, but they also did not want to be called enemies of the environment. So that was one of the many ideas that we had at the Council of Economic Advisors that was turned down. We actually had an even better idea in the George H.W. Bush administration when I was Deputy Executive Secretary for Research, when I was Deputy Executive Secretary of the Domestic Policy Council. We wanted to lower capital gains taxes. And of course, Congress would not pass a reduction in capital gains taxes. But all of you know reducing taxes is a good idea, right? Yes. So we thought that you could just redefine capital gains as capital gains exclusive of inflation. Just redefine it and say it's inflation adjusted. And then you would not have to pass a new law in Congress that would lower taxes. It would go down because so much capital gains, especially for assets that have been held a very long time, are inflationary gains. They're not real gains. Well, that idea was also shut down. That didn't get anywhere either. Well, let me move on to just a few of the ideas that these different presidents had. Now, President Kennedy was worried about 1.7% inflation. How many of you are worried about 1.7% inflation? How many of you know what inflation is right now? The latest CPI. Well, the latest CPI is, anyone have a guess? 2.7, yes, 2.7 is right. It's 2.7. And President Trump says 2.7 is really good. He says inflation has come down, and it has come down since President Biden's time. But President Kennedy was worried about 1.7%. So he said that he wanted to keep wage increases in line with productivity growth, which was about 3% per year, and limit price hikes to normal markups. So he wanted to adopt voluntary wage price guideposts in 1962, which he did. And he said, quote, "Guideposts for non-inflationary wage and price behavior would be enforced not by law, but through the force of informed public opinion." How many of you think that's a good idea, using informed public opinion to enforce a regulation? It's not a good idea. You do not get very far. And I don't know how many lawyers there are here or how many aspiring law school students there are here, but just making something voluntary generally does not work. And it did not work. After inflation did decline a little bit to 1.3% by 1963 from 1.7% in 1960, but it was quickly wiped away in the mid-1960s as the guideposts lost traction. By 1966 to 68, inflation had accelerated into the 4.5% range, 4 to 5%. So his voluntary guideposts only had a temporary effect. Then we went on to President Nixon's formal wage and price controls. So President Nixon believed temporary controls would break expectations. And what he did was he put in place a 90-day freeze on wages, prices, and rents as part of his new economic policy. And this was running at about 4.2%, and he wanted to stabilize the economy. But that did not have any effect either. Has anyone heard of President Jerry Ford's Whip Inflation Now campaign, the WIN campaign? Again, that was a laughingstock. Yeah, Whip Inflation Now. And he declared inflation public enemy number one and called for a grassroots mobilization against it. And it was quick to slide into ridicule, and many people turned the buttons upside down, and they wore them upside down to read NIM, meaning no immediate miracles, which was a jab at the program's ineffectiveness. And again, as you can see, during Nixon's time, the WIN campaign had virtually no effect on inflation, which was running at about 12% when Ford introduced it. And then finally, there was President Carter's voluntary wage price guidelines, running at 7.6% in 1978. He did not like inflation running at 7.6%. He had new voluntary wage price restraints program in October, revising the approach, and that did not work either. He made it clear that firms defying the standards could face punitive action, including denying federal contracts, tighter regulatory scrutiny, and even publicly naming non-compliers on an enemies list. What that did was allow the government to pick winners and losers, which was not effective either. Well, President Carter did do some very positive things, which ended up lowering inflation. He deregulated in the transportation area. He deregulated airlines, trucking, and railroads. And that had immense effects that we can see today. So even though he was not successful, none of these presidents were successful at lowering inflation. President Carter at least moved in a deregulatory manner. And we're going to hear about those advantages and those successes from Jim Lucia. So, thank you.
Thank you, Diana. Like Harold Hamm, we are optimists here. We're going to end the panel on an upswing. with a remarkable story about success. Jim, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Kent. I love talking about success, especially big, happy stories. And today I'm going to tell you about someone who, unfortunately, has become a forgotten man, but who actually may be one of the most important figures in American history. His name is William Steiger, author of the Steiger Amendment. And Amity asked me to come here and tell you about Steiger and the amendment. And I actually thought the whole panel was going to be about the Steiger Amendment, so I've got to talk about it in extra detail. The best way to explain this is simply to ask the question, who here has an Apple Watch, an Apple computer, an iPhone? Who posts on Instagram? Who uses Google as a search engine? Who has a friend who drives a Tesla? Who's sort of totally into these wild tech products that we get from Silicon Valley? Everybody. Haven't even talked about biotech either. But one thing made this possible, and that was the Steiger Amendment. Perhaps the thing that differentiates America, makes America more robust and more successful than other countries in the world, is the gigantic pool of venture capital that we have that's driving investment and innovation in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. I'll give you a number. Before 1978, that number was about $20 million a year. That's 20 million with an M. You know how much it is now? Last year, venture capital worldwide was more than $500 billion, but in the US it was $350 billion. So thanks to Bill Steiger, we now have this pipeline, this fantastic market, this $350 billion that is helping create more and more new companies like HP. Mr. DeMuth told us all about how HP was a very solid company, had to struggle through the war years, had great engineers, and benefited from the rise of the entertainment industry, did business with the developing healthcare industry, did military contracts, and so forth. But in the 1970s, we had a problem. We had a lot of engineers, a lot of people trained at Hewlett-Packard, Fairchild Semiconductors, and other big companies, and we had a lot of people that were really, really, really into electronics. Mr. Meyer may know about Fry's Electronics. Who here even remembers Fry's Electronics? They've closed the... It was the most fantastic store ever. Every store had a unique internal decoration scheme, but people would go to Fry's Electronics, they'd buy the parts, they'd put stuff together, they'd go to the Homebrew Computer Club in San Francisco and think, wow, here is a fantastic little gadget, a computer, an electronic device that's going to make me billions. This could be terrific. And in fact, Steve Jobs and Mike Wozniak were among these guys. People were building devices, and they saw devices possibilities beyond measure. But in the 1970s, because of the inflation that Diana was talking about, it was very difficult for U.S. companies to get financing to do anything, and I'll explain why in just a moment. So there was a dearth of capital in Silicon Valley at a time when all kinds of new technologies were coming to the fore, not just in electronics, by the way, not just computers, but biotech. Biotech, in fact, was one of the big drivers of the change that Steiger brought about. And to cut to the chase, what Steiger did is he introduced an amendment to cut the capital gains tax from 49%, which was, had been raised 4 times, highest ever, to 28. And the reason Steiger is so interesting is that he did this. He was a Republican congressman, but he was not your typical Republican congressman. He is what John Fund called the wunderkind of his generation. He graduated from the University of Wisconsin in 1960. When he was not much older than most of you, he was elected to the Wisconsin Assembly and served 2 terms. And then in 1966, he came to Congress as the youngest member of Congress at the time, age 28. And he only served 5 terms. He was reelected a 6th time, but he died suddenly before that term happened. And that's really why we don't know much about him today. But when you read the stories about him, they are positively fantastic. He's described as someone who was witty, informal, humorous, approachable. And that's literally what his obit says in the New York Times. Tip O'Neill, House Speaker of the House, said that he was one of the nicest people ever, great man to work with. So what did he do? Well, you might think about tax, but the first thing he did was to help set up OSHA, Occupational Health and Safety. Not a typical thing for a junior member of Congress to do, but he played a big part of that. He set up the Clear Lakes Act, which helped clean up the Great Lakes. And he was also probably the leading Republican spokesman against the draft in the Vietnam War. So, he's no one's typical conservative guy, very, very moderate in most respects. But he heard this story about the dearth of capital in Silicon Valley and decided this was something that he had to fix. In fact, he did it in record time, too. This was the year, was 1978. I'd like to point out Howard Segermark, who was here. Howard worked on the Senate side, helping coordinate the tax bill of 1978, in which the Steiger Amendment is the big part we remember today, back when the idea of supply-side economics was brand new. Also, to connect with you students, I was a high school student at the time. I was doing my algebra homework in the cafeteria of the Dirksen Senate Office building, and Howard walked in with Art Laffer. And Art drew me my own Laffer curve on a Senate cafeteria napkin, which I wish I still had. But, going back to the astonishing achievement, you have a young Republican guy from a state where he's the only other Republican congressman. Democrats had a 100-seat advantage, a 100-seat margin in the House of Representatives. The Democratic Senate had been forever. The Democratic president, Jimmy Carter, was dead set against the Steiger Amendment. In fact, Carter actually wanted to have an increase in the capital gains tax and a tax on unrealized capital gains. So we can see that bad ideas, go back to eternity. They've been around for a long time. So despite all of this, Steiger made friends with everybody. He was such a likable, intelligent, open, charming, authentic guy that the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee and the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, Al Ullman on the House side, the great Russell Long that Howard will remember on the Senate side, they decided that, yep, you know what, this guy is right. We're going to support this guy over our president because his idea is so compelling. And believe it or not, Steiger introduced his bill in March, around March 7th. It got through the House Ways and Means Committee on August 4th. It got through the whole House on August 14th. It was passed by Congress in October. Jimmy Carter signed it into law on November 6, 1978. And the results were almost immediate. If you look at the statistics for venture capital, there was more venture capital raised in the closing quarter of 1978 than in the entire decade of the 1970s before that. People knew that this was going to make a really big difference, and it did. The problem is, the very sad outcome is that Steiger died of a heart attack less than 1 month after that bill was passed. So, if you read, again, the New York Times obituary, they're saying he was the most wonderful person to work with. Tip O'Neill, the Democratic Speaker of the House, loved him. There was a special order on the floor of the House of Representatives, 30 pages in the congressional record of all of his colleagues, Republican and Democrat alike, talking about what an open, approachable, honest, informal, intelligent, innovative guy this was. And yet, he died less than a month after the bill passed, and yet we could see the results almost immediately. Why did I ask you about Apple Computer? Well, the Apple IPO was 1980. It was 1 year after the Steiger Amendment passed. It was the biggest IPO since Ford. It raised the astonishing total of $2 billion. $2 billion, imagine that. It was big money. It was the biggest IPO since Ford. Steve Jobs made $280 million overnight, and many, many, many other people became millionaires. It was really the proof of the concept that venture-funded technological innovation in Silicon Valley was a fantastic way to go forward. And after Apple, of course, there was Cisco. Microsoft technically wasn't venture-funded, but it was basically the same type of thing. Google, all the other companies I mentioned followed this path made possible by the Steiger Amendment. Another thing happened, incidentally, by the way. The venture capital industry realized they needed more capital, so a deregulatory change they made was to address the ERISA standards. If you run a pension, if you run an insurance company, there used to be something called the prudent man rule, or the prudent investor rule, that essentially said you had to buy boring bonds and not much of anything else. They got that changed to say that a prudent investor might actually want to do venture capital too. So the combination of much lower tax rates plus a gigantic new source of capital from insurance and pension funds turned into this multi-hundred billion with a B, pipeline driving the technologies that define the American economy today. It was really fantastic, and it all came down to one guy who saw an idea, moved forward with it, and just had the people skills and the personality and the optimism to make this happen. You know, we hear a lot about people that served with him at the same time. Jack Kemp is supposed to have been the guy who realized that you needed to reach out to minorities, reach out to young people, reach out to old people, broaden the coalition. Well, you know, Bill Steiger was Jack Kemp on steroids in the time. I mean, you know, Kemp worked with him. Bill Steiger made friends with Danny Rostenkowski, and you know, on the House side, very famous Ways and Means chairman after Al Ullman. He made friends with another guy named Dick Gephardt. These were people who worked with Ronald Reagan as Democrats later to continue the great tax reforms of 1981, which dropped the capital gains tax rate to 20% of the Tax Reform Act of '86, which had fantastic results, and then, of course, the Taxpayer Relief Act of 1997, which Bill Clinton signed, took the rate back down again to 20%. So all thanks to the agency, the brilliance, the charm of a guy that no one remembers now, we have an American economy that is the envy of the world because of our ability to direct the capital markets into innovation, whether it's biotech, electronics, or, you know, many, many other things too. So, you know, when you look at your watch next time, think, thank you, thank you, thank you, Bill Steiger.
Thank you, Jim. We're going to move immediately into a conversation with you, and I'm going to draw on that great sage, I think anybody would use scare quotes, of the progressive era, John Dewey. And I'll admit my bias. He said it's okay to be biased as long as you announce it. My bias is toward the younger people in this audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand. If you are in the part of the room to my far right, I cannot see you, and if you have a question, I invite you to line up near where the placards are in the back of the room so that I can identify you for your question. Why don't we go right here in the front, the young man with the glasses there first. And for all of you, questions will be limited to 30 seconds.
Hi, I'm Joel Vincent. I'm from Palm Beach, Florida, and I'm a first year at Yale University. I had a question for Ms. Frigate-Ross. How should policymakers think about regulating emerging technologies without slowing productivity or innovation?
Thank you, Joel.
Yeah, I think that there should be basic safety standards, and then they should just allow competition and allow these technologies to go forward. Basic performative safety standards, and I think we see this a lot with nuclear power. We have over-regulation in the nuclear power area. Designers have thought of small modular reactors, but these have not yet come on the market because of over-regulation. We used to be able to build a nuclear power plant in 4 years. Now it takes us 15 years. The federal government needs to take off some of this regulation, put basic standards in place, and allow states to have further regulations as they need.
Again, we'll go right here to the front.
Hello, my name is Grayson. I go to the University of Notre Dame. Absolutely. I think we can all agree that the importance of entrepreneurs is paramount. However, this conversation did not really focus on the billions of dollars that the federal government spends in research and development. And specifically with the iPhone example, so many technologies were developed or perfected either due to defense spending or from public universities, such as like a touchscreen or GPS. So this question can actually go to the entire panel. I was curious your thoughts on what the role of the federal government in research and development can be.
You want to tackle that? Diana?
Sure. I think that we need to look at spending on government. Government spending should do what the private sector cannot do. The private sector is perfectly capable of investing funds in research and development much better than the government can, because the government picks winners and losers, and if the project does not work out, the taxpayer is stuck with the bill. And also the government can use favoritism when it is picking projects. In contrast, if a private company invests, it knows if it loses, its shareholders lose. It has a big downside to losing, unlike that bureaucrat in the energy department. So unless it's something of national security where they don't think that a private company is able to do that because of sensitivity and intelligence reasons, I would suggest cutting these research budgets down to zero, lowering taxes, giving the money back to the taxpayers, and allowing these private companies to invest.
Please go ahead.
I have a different view of that. I'm not for eliminating government expenditures on research. For one thing, I think that the nation needs to defend itself and to have a very large defense establishment. Defense is a research-intensive business, especially now, and there's a lot of research money in the Defense Department and in some of the other agencies that. Am I going to stand here and say there's no waste, fraud, and abuse? Absolutely not. Any government agency is going to have a lot of that. But I don't think that when it comes to defending the nation, when we're thinking about defense, that we should be thinking no money for research. But I think that research expenditures should be for governmental purposes rather than just kind of leaving it out in the air. You can imagine that business firms will underinvest in research that has big social benefits that they cannot earn returns on. And yet we see, like in Silicon Valley, fabulous, these days, hundreds of billions of dollars spent on research whose returns will be very difficult for firms like Google to monetize. So in general, the massive advantages are with the private sector. If we think of federal dollars in research being for particular public purposes, which aren't just kind of research in general, but for something like military defense, we'll find that there are lots and lots of commercial spin-offs from that. But government shouldn't be thinking about commerce; it should be thinking about its own responsibilities.
And I just want to say that this is why I said I did add that security considerations and intelligence were a reason for research. So I agree with Chris.
I'll move here in just a moment. I have a question for Hank and Jim. We heard reference to Emma's Oil. 1961, the beginning of the period under discussion, was the final book published during the lifetime of John Steinbeck. It's called The Winner of Our Discontents, and he selected as his protagonist for the middle American normal life a grocer. Chris gave us a presentation where he used the word quintessential, talking about Silicon Valley. Quintessential entrepreneur, I believe you said. Jim and Hank, as we look today, what is the quintessential median entrepreneur in American life?
Well, I'll take a stab at this. Clearly, the basic entrepreneur is someone who's just trying to lead a better life, to do something interesting. And it can be anything from a taco stand to a garage. Take some startup capital for all of these things. And the overall environment for the capital markets is important. It's not just for Silicon Valley billionaires. Back in the 1970s, I can remember when my parents could not get a mortgage to buy a new house, no matter what, because interest rates were high, inflation was high, mortgages were unreachable. And so that put home ownership out of people's reach. I talked earlier today about how inflation and the sort of collapse of the stock market in the 70s made it harder for businesses to raise capital. But you still got to make capital available in amounts that people can use, whether it's at a kind of an American equivalent of a micro-lending thing, or someone doing a side hustle on publishing electronically. There's just no limit to it. It's just anybody who thinks that they can contribute to the community in a certain way and possibly make some money. One of the great quotations of all times came from Dr. Samuel Johnson, author of Johnson's Dictionary, perhaps the first newspaper columnist in history. And he said that no man is more innocently occupied than in the course of making money. And that would basically be it. They can be anybody.
Very good. Hank, do you want to tackle it?
I I don't have a better answer than that, but it makes me wonder about what barriers of entry to entrepreneurship there are in different sectors of the economy. And so when you mention the taco stand, there's a lower barrier of entry there than something that requires some degree of capital or significant degree of education. And so I would think that it is that entrepreneurial spirit transcends all of these industries. And the grocer works, I guess, because he's ubiquitous in the landscape. And I think the guy who has the fast food franchise may be the same way. And the question is, can he learn from that franchise perhaps and create the next iteration of Starbucks or of McDonald's? That kind of ladder of entrepreneurship, I think, is more available than some of the others.
Or an occupational license required by a state is another barrier.
I think we have a young lady to my right with the white jacket or gray jacket.
And this will be the last question for this panel.
For our last question. No, I'm sorry, you're part of the staff. So you've just been put on the spot. You can hand the microphone to anyone who will ask our final question. There we go. Thank you for that.
There's a question for Diana. So you touched on one of my pet issues, which is the indexing of capital gains for inflation. During the first Trump administration, a member of his economic team told me that was going to be a big priority in Trump's second term, which didn't really happen in 2020. I'm wondering two things. Is that something you think is still on the table, and can it be done with just a regulatory tweak?
Well, I am not a lawyer, but the lawyer in charge of the White House in the George H.W. Bush administration said afterwards, I was too cautious in pouring water on this idea, implying that, yes, it could pass the legal tests. And there'd be numerous memos on how it can pass legal tests, redefining capital gains as capital gains exclusive of inflation.
Is it still on the table, do you think?
Many ideas are on the table, and there's a lot of avid discussion in the White House as to the pros and cons of all of them.
If I could add to that, I'd just say wait for the State of the Union. People tracking this are waiting for the State of the Union. We don't know if it's going to be in there, but that would be the logical place.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've had a tremendous education over the last hour. Please help me in thanking the panel.